nieopisywalny i opisywalny. Co? Co?
Każdemu zdarza się powiedzieć coś, co przynajmniej częściowo jest prawdziwe. Uważam, że wielką krzywdą dla prawdy jest ignorowanie argumentów osoby, z którą się nie zgadzamy w całości. Częściowo takie osoby mogą mieć rację. Tym bardziej, że Bóg może używać także ateistów, by spełniać swoją wolę. Może także natchnąć ich serce, by powiedzieli jakąś prawdę, którą osoby wierzące z jakiegoś powodu odrzucają. Dlatego też muszę przyznać, że z dużą częścią z jednego z najnowszych filmów Łukasza Wybrańczyka z kanału Śmiem Wątpić się zgadzam. Także uważam, że istnieją niespójności i nielogiczności w doktrynie nicejskiej na temat Jezusa Chrystusa. O dziwo. Jednak jego film nie omawia wszystkich chrystologii możliwych. Mianowicie nie zawiera na przykład tej wyznawanej przeze mnie. Ze względu na chęć bycia zwięzłym, nie omówię jej w tym filmie z uwagi na ograniczony czas filmu.
Zdaje się ewidentne, w czym tkwi problem. Jedno z najbardziej podstawowych praw logiki, prawo niesprzeczności, mówi w skrócie: nie występują żadne sprzeczności. Nie ma żadnych prawdziwych sprzeczności. Dla jakiegokolwiek twierdzenia P to nieprawda, że zarówno P jest prawdą, jak i negacja P jest prawdą. Dla przykładu, albo dana figura geometryczna jest kołem, albo nie jest kołem. Nie może być tak, że figura geometryczna zarówno jest, jak i nie jest kołem. To jest zwykła sprzeczność.
Pozostaje mi się jedynie zgodzić. Wydaje mi się, że katolicy także by się zgodzili. Być może nie z tym, że sprzeczne rzeczy nie istnieją. W sumie też się nie zgadzam z tym stwierdzeniem. Pozorne sprzeczności mogą istnieć, o ile są pozorne. Sprzeczności wskazują na coś innego, wskazują na kłamstwo. Prawda nie jest sprzeczna i dlatego uważam, że to wskazuje na to, że sobory przekłamały prawdę.
Czy Jezus jest widzialny, pojmowalny, ograniczony, czy podlega cierpieniu, czy jest opisywalny? Cóż, jak mówi Sobór Konstantynopolitański IV, uznajemy też, że siódmy święty i powszechny Sobór, uroczyście zebrany po raz drugi w Nicei, ogłosił prawowierną naukę, wyznając, że jest jeden i ten sam Chrystus Pan, niewidzialny i widzialny, niepojmowalny i pojmowalny, nieograniczony i ograniczony, niecierpiętliwy i podległy cierpieniu, nieopisywalny i opisywalny. Co? Co?
Niedoinformowany katolik będzie się upierał, że jest to tak zwana pozorna sprzeczność i będzie się starał zachować tutaj godność i rozum człowieka, że się tak wyrażę. Jednak doinformowany katolik musi powiedzieć prawdę. Jest to tak zwane misterium wiary. I na tym można by zakończyć.
Pozwólcie, że zadam wam pytanie. To naprawdę powinno być proste pytanie, ok? Pytanie brzmi tak. Czy Jezus cierpiał za nas i umarł na krzyżu? Brzmi jak najbardziej podstawowe pytanie na temat chrześcijaństwa, jakie można w ogóle zadać. Nie? Nie? Cyryl do Jana z Antiochii. Pozostaje on, Boży Logos, jaki jest. Nigdy się nie odmienia. Nie odmieni się w przyszłości. Natura jego nie jest bowiem podległa zmianie. Wszyscy wyznajemy, że Logos Boży ze swojej natury nie podlega cierpieniu. Choć gdy z najwyższą mądrością przygotował tajemnicę zbawienia, ujrzano, że sobie samemu przeznaczył cierpienia i przypadły one jego własnemu ciału. List papieża Leona, niepodlegający cierpieniu Bóg, nie zawahał się być człowiekiem podległym cierpieniu, a nieśmiertelny poddał się prawom śmierci.
Czy przekaz biblijny zawiera tego typu wygibasy? Nie. To po co komu takie wygibasy? To jest bardzo dobre pytanie, na które mam nadzieję, że każdy z was spróbuje znaleźć jakąkolwiek odpowiedź. Tak więc, jak widać, ateiści także mogą mieć określony, słuszny punkt widzenia w określonej sprawie i domagać się racjonalnych odpowiedzi. Uważam, że nie jest to nieracjonalne, by się ich domagać. Tak samo jak ateiści domagają się odpowiedzi na pytanie do tego, że jeżeli faktycznie się przyjmie, że istnieje wiele bogów, to ciężko stwierdzić, który jest prawdziwy. Jest to bardzo słuszny argument i bardzo słuszne stwierdzenie. Jeżeli przyjąć to stwierdzenie jedynie jako to, co ono mówi, bez żadnych innych informacji, które się posiada, to dane pytanie wydaje się słusznym. Dane pytanie, który Bóg jest prawdziwy, jest, że nie można stwierdzić, który jest prawdziwy, to zdanie jest prawdą, ale jest to prawdą wtedy, gdy monoteizm jest jedynie efektem ewolucji idei religijnych. Jednak dane pytanie byłoby nieistotne, czy też posiadałoby odpowiedź i nikt nie musiałby zadawać tego pytania, gdyby pierwotną religią ludzkości był monoteizm, a wszelkie inne wierzenia były jedynie degeneracją danych pierwotnych wierzeń, w tym wierzenia w wielu bogów. A taki właśnie pogląd o tym, że istniał pierwotny monoteizm, prezentuje dr Corduan.
Dr. Corduan, welcome back to the Trinities podcast.
Thank you, Dale. It's once again a real pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
This week we're talking about your 2013 book entitled In the Beginning, God, A Fresh Look at the Case for Original Monotheism. This is a really interesting book, and I learned a lot about this. How long have you been thinking about this issue of original monotheism, and what is that claim?
Well, the claim is that religion did not start, as many people believe, on the level of people worshiping spirits, doing magic, and so forth, but that human religion began with people believing in a single God who created the universe and worshiping him and then abiding to a certain extent by the rules that he has given to humanity. So religion started with a single God. I first got intrigued by this topic a long time ago. I was still in school in Germany before we moved to the United States. So I must have been 12 maybe. And part of the curriculum at the time in the schools was regular religious instruction. Of course, for that we divided into Protestant and Catholic sections. And there was one day when the Protestant teacher was sick or something, and the Catholic priest who gave the religion instruction took his place. So we were all together, and he started to talk about the fact that oftentimes tribal people, as I would call them now, believe in one God. They may not tell you about it for quite a while, and all you may see is their interaction with spirits and so forth. But if you really get to know them and what they believe, you find out that behind all of that is the belief in a single God who really is the only God. Well, that had me intrigued. And so then at that fairly young age, I started to think about that. Then in my college years, I read a book by Robert Brow on religion, and he mentioned the same thing, that there is good evidence for an original monotheism. And then as I studied religions and immersed myself in that topic, I became more and more convinced that they were right, and therefore the Bible also was right in saying that religion began with the one personal God who revealed himself.
Now, obviously, if a person believes in a literal Adam and Eve, then they're going to think that the first human religion was monotheism. Now, when you actually make the case for monotheism in this book, does your case depend on young earth creationism, or does it depend on belief in a historical Adam and Eve?
It does not depend on young earth creationism. It does certainly imply creation. But you see, so much has changed in anthropology over the last few decades that really allows me to make that case without tying myself directly to a specific theology of creation. The belief used to be commonly accepted that human beings, Homo sapiens, evolved in different times and places around the world. So if at that time, that was basically the belief when Wilhelm Schmidt, whom we'll get to in a minute, wrote his works, if you say that there was one point of origin, then that would have been considered laughable and just not scientific. But that has changed now thanks to genetic studies and studies of mitochondrial DNA and so forth. It's not disputed, but it is widely accepted now that there was an original set of Homo sapiens, who we could call Adam and Eve, who actually started the species Homo sapiens. Now, when exactly that was, I'm not sure how much we can trust the calculations, but the origin of humanity is not millions of years ago. When I say humanity, I mean, of course, then Homo sapiens, but a much shorter time before then. So you have now a widely accepted belief in the single origin of Homo sapiens, and consequently, the fact that there are human beings all over the world implies that there must have been then a lengthy history of migrations. From that one place of origin, people wound up moving all over the world.
Now, this idea of original monotheism, you mentioned that you had run across it a couple of times when you were younger. Mm-hmm. And it was a minority viewpoint that was out there. It's interesting to me as a philosopher who works on early modern philosophy that things have flipped around quite a lot. The Cambridge Platonists were some of the earliest real scholars who tried to dig into other religions, and they believed original monotheism. Mm-hmm. Then again, David Hume was kind of an early religion scholar, and he seemed to think that monotheism was a later development, and then it flipped around in the 19th century. It's unclear to me exactly why, other than just general evolutionary ideas were in the air. And I have to confess that before I looked into this much, I just kind of assumed, I'm sure I picked this up from historians or anthropologists or others, I just kind of assumed that monotheism must be a product of, highly advanced civilization, that somehow this is not something you would find apart from those civilizations. But it's not so obvious. I mean, human beings are human beings. Their cognitive capacities are the same.
Right.
What's so hard about monotheism that you'd have to be some kind of modern man, 20th century or whatever your idea of a modern advanced culture is. Why would you have to be one of those people to be a monotheist?
In fact, as Andrew Lang said, you have two potential options there, or at least that's how I'm paraphrasing him. One would be that in various times and places, various religions went through various stages in various complex ways, ultimately to arrive at monotheism. The other option is, at least one other option, is the easier one, and I think the far more natural one. You look at the world around you and you ask, who made all this? And it doesn't take a lot of intelligence to ask that, though I maintain that, as a matter of fact, as you say, people were as intelligent as we are, but it's a very simple and very natural question. People are used to things not just coming into existence without being caused. So to look at things and ask, is there a maker behind this, would be a very, very natural thing to think of.
And as even David Hume points out, it also seems natural to assume only one source, unless there's some specific reason to assume more than one maker of the world. Another thing I think that I assumed, and I'm not sure I really had any good reason for this now, is that the way you get to be a monotheist is you start off with a whole bunch of gods and you somehow pare them down to one. And a lot of people, I think, suppose that this is due to, I don't know, nationalistic pride. Our God's better than yours. Hey, our God's the only God, or our God's the highest God. Well, that's one way you could change into monotheist, but couldn't you also fall out of it as well? Just start with one God, and then for various reasons, now you're serving many gods.
Well, as a matter of fact, that's what happened in the historical record. The direction of development, more often than not, is away from monotheism into polytheism. I mean, we can say with, I think, a pretty good amount of assurance that Indo-European people at one time worshipped one god who was in the sky, called Deus Pitar in Sanskrit, Zeus or Jupiter or Tyr or whatever, and that he is the one creator god, and that then he accumulated other gods, as it were, in the minds of the people. I mean, it all has to come back to not what is a acceptable theory, but the data. Looking at what happened in history, and then by anthropological methods trying to establish what we can know about the potentially original religion of human beings.
And we'll get into the case for original monotheism in just a second, but one more preliminary comment I had was, as I read your book and you were quoting these scholars, particularly late 19th century, early 20th century scholars, over and over there were these embarrassing statements to the effect that, savages, primitives, and so on couldn't possibly have had this wonderful idea of monotheism, and they must have got it from Westerners, they must have got it from missionaries. I mean, it's just a big assumption on display for everybody to see. It was so hard for most people to even bring that into question.
I'm looking for a quote here that goes back to Hartland, a scholar. No, I can't find it now, but he says, how can we expect people who don't have an organized government and who wear loincloths or whatever and can't even count up to 7, how can we expect those kinds of people to have such a lofty idea as monotheism? And that's a non sequitur if I ever heard one. It just doesn't add up, as it were. What difference does it make how high you can count or what style your clothes are to whether you believe in a single God who created the world? What Wilhelm Schmidt did, and he followed a British scholar named Andrew Lang, is to put the belief in original monotheism on sound scholarly footing, apart from just making it an object of faith among theistic believers. He did so by applying a method that discriminated between earlier and later cultures. Let me start with what Andrew Lang said and then pick up with what Schmidt added to it. Andrew Lang was a disciple of E.B. Tylor, who was a leading advocate of the evolution of religion. That religion began on a very, quote, primitive level, savage people who believed that the world was filled with spirits and one needed to do rituals in order to appease them. And then eventually this belief in spirits became a belief in many gods and then finally turned into monotheism. Well, there was a man named Howitt who was doing a lot of anthropological work in Australia, studying the beliefs of various Australian tribes. Andrew Lang read through his reports and came to realize that there were some tribes who believed in a single God and worshipped the single God as the only God. And there were some tribes who believed in many different spirits and served them. Now, he was not able to tell which of those tribes might represent the earliest religion of humanity, but he did think that the kind of monotheism, we can call it that were portrayed in those reports could not have evolved from animism, from the belief in many spirits. There didn't seem to be any linkage. So he said that as far as he could tell, some tribal cultures apparently held to a monotheism that was not based on some earlier kind of religion. Now, in his heart of hearts, he thought that those tribes represented the earliest human cultures. He did not have a way of arranging a chronology in order to make that case. Nonetheless, he was severely criticized by others for drawing that inference. Wilhelm Schmidt's contribution then. Wilhelm Schmidt was a Catholic priest who studied anthropology. He formed an anthropological organization initially to help missionaries. He was German, but spent quite a bit of time living in Austria. And he compiled the reports of anthropologists from all over the world. And then by applying his method, the so-called culture historical method, he was able to show that those cultures which seem to be the least developed in other aspects of culture are actually the ones that have a pretty clear monotheistic religion. There's no denying that cultures have developed. There are cultures still that don't have pottery, don't have metals, and so forth, and live on a total foraging basis. And the assumption is that those least developed cultures also represent what humanity may have been like in its earliest stages. And among them, the religion is monotheistic. Now, the description of the one God does not entirely dovetail with the description of God in the Bible, though in many cases it comes very close. But the fundamental fact is that they only recognized one God as the real God.
Now, Dr. Corduan, what was Schmidt's magnum opus? You mentioned it just very briefly, but tell us a little more about it. Is this a little pamphlet that we can just pick up and read?
You wish. His, and I know why you're asking that. His magnum opus is a 10-volume set averaging 800 to 1,000 pages each in German, called Der Ursprung der Gottesidee. And he never got to finish it. He died before it was finished. I'm not sure it would ever have been finished.
What's the English title?
Well, it would be The Origin of the Idea of God, but there is no English translation of it, and I don't think there ever will be. Now, before going back to that for a second, there is an English translation of a summary of the first volume, which is called The Origin and Growth of Religion, Facts and Theories. Wilhelm Schmidt translated by H.J. Rose and Mark Phillips. He heard me mention that the book was not very accessible, and he approached the copyright holders and the ones who had all the rights and republished the book. So it's now available at just $25 or something like that. So it is possible to read at least that part of Schmidt's work in translation. Now, to come back to his magnum opus, The Origin of the Idea of God is an extremely detailed analysis of the various reports on different tribal religions. So we're not just dealing with someone who came out with a theory and then grabbed whatever material was available to support his case, but he did thorough studies of the documentation. The man was truly a genius, and of course, being celibate probably contributed to the availability of time that he devoted to those things. But it's a very, very carefully documented study by applying the cultural historical method to these different cultures. And then the conclusion is, as I said, that those cultures which seem to have deviated the least from what may have been original human culture, who show the least development, also hold to a monotheistic religion. Okay, the European culture now dominates. There are also Native American people living here. Now, who was here first? Is it difficult to tell who came first, the Europeans or the American Indians? I don't think so. And I think archaeologists or whoever several hundred years from now will be able to tell that the Europeans came later than the American Indians and supplanted them and had them adapt to European culture and so forth. The basic principle is, it's based on the idea that, first of all, there was migration, and that all other things being equal, the more developed cultures would displace or absorb the less developed cultures.
Because they would prosper.
Yeah, and they would have better weapons, better ways of surviving. So you're going to find the least developed cultures on the geographical margins. The area that they may have occupied at one time has now been taken over by more developed cultures. So you have, say, an area where there are people living in the desert. Their technology does not go far beyond sticks and stones. They're living in a place where you can barely survive. And adjacent to that area is a place where it is much easier to survive, and it's occupied by people who have a higher level of technology. Now, it seems to me not all that difficult to speculate that the people with the higher technology drove the less developed people into the less desirable places.
So it's not making a value judgment about which culture is better. It's just simply some will outcompete others.
Right. Yeah, there's absolutely no value judgment in there. I mean, I don't know if a culture with CDs and microwaves is better than a culture without all those, quote, conveniences. But, there's no questioning that the technology is on a much more developed level, and that will make a difference in how people migrate. Now, it's also fascinating here in looking at the history of anthropology. Migration until 15, 20 years ago was a taboo subject. At least in American anthropology, you were not supposed to study the migration of various tribes because that would bring in too much speculation, but you were supposed to just look at a tribe or culture as it existed right then and there when it was being studied. Well, if you take that point of view, you're really eliminating a lot of sources of information and a lot of good ways of explaining different data. Fortunately, that taboo has now been lifted, and so again, that was one of the areas where Wilhelm Schmidt really broke with what many anthropologists held in counting in the idea of migration. But since it's become more accepted that humanity began at one particular time and place in some way, and of course we believe in creation, that the only way that the earth could have been populated is through constant streams of migration where the more developed cultures then took over areas that had been occupied by less developed ones.
So the point is not that we can tell necessarily which culture is the earliest or that we found the original culture, but as best we can tell what the oldest are, they tend to be monotheistic, and that is what one would expect if originally humans had been monotheistic.
Mm-hmm. All science is a matter of probability, but the probabilities are pretty high that the correlation holds. It's not just, let us theorize that the least developed culture is the one that's most closely to original human culture, but there's pretty good reason to believe that based on the data that you find, the migration data, the various levels of providing, of survival, of gathering food and so forth. Hunter-gatherer societies are most likely much older or more representative of an older culture than ones that have agriculture or that raise cattle.
That much seems to be beyond controversy. I mean, most people think that agricultural societies arose at some relatively recent time, if not in known history, at least at some point.
It's not as much beyond controversy as you might like to think. It's recently become much, much more accepted. But a lot of these things, which in Wilhelm Schmidt's time, that is the first half of the 20th century, a lot of these things were disputed during the time that he did his work, and they appear to be common sense to us now, but people just did not want to get involved in chronology. They just wanted to say, okay, you have these kinds of cultures, and we take them as they are. I'm speaking at least from the perspective of an